Hello everyone, welcome to another video from Knowledge India. In this particular video, we'll try and simplify S3 access points for you. So let's try and understand what problem does it solve, why did it come into existence, and post that we will go ahead and see a practical demo around creating S3 access points and actually using it. So all of us understand about S3 and bucket policy, I hope. So let's say there is an S3 bucket in your organization, and this bucket is currently used to store certain data or files, and that is shared among different teams or applications. And the access level requirement is different for every team or application. Let's say there is a team one, which should have read and write access to this particular bucket, right? Which means, let's say S3 put object, S3 get object, and there is then team 2 which should have access to, let's say, a particular folder within this bucket, and so on and so forth, right? So as the time passes, what happens is that your S3 bucket policy becomes big, right? It is getting regularly updated, and with time it becomes really difficult to audit all those changes. You know that bucket policy is one policy per bucket, right? You cannot have multiple, and also there is a limit on the size of the bucket policy. Now, because this single bucket policy is responsible for controlling the access of dozens, sometimes hundreds of applications to a particular bucket, it becomes quite problematic with time, right? If I go ahead and show you the similar thing with an example, think about it like this. There's an S3 bucket. Let's say it has got data which belongs to different business units, BU1, BU2, BU3. Now from BU1, there's an application which has to access this particular data. That's why there is a role created. There's a user or group of users in business unit 2, and so on and so forth. So what happens is, all the different business unit users, whether it is from business unit 1, 2, or 3, all of them are actually hitting the same S3 endpoint, right? That is the first problem. So there's no clear segregation. All of them are hitting the same S3 endpoint. Over and above that, if you look at the bucket policy, right, as more and more business units get onboarded, or there is a requirement of giving access to a new application or to a new user, what happens is you go ahead and add statements in the same bucket policy, right? In that one existing bucket policy, you go ahead and keep adding statements. What you will do probably is that with every statement, you will go ahead and specify a particular ARN in the resource part, right? So you may go ahead and, let's say, write the ARN of the bucket and then say /bu01/* and so on, right? You are doing this to restrict the role from BU01 to be able to access the files or data which is there inside BU01 folder. So that way you go ahead and do, right? But with more and more business units coming up or new requirements coming up, your single bucket policy becomes quite heavy and it becomes difficult to manage. Have you seen that scenario or not? Okay. Now, this problem can be solved by S3 access points, because you can go ahead and create a separate S3 access point for every user or application need, right? Suppose you have one S3 bucket and you need to give access to 20 different teams to this particular S3 bucket. So what you could do is you can go ahead and actually create 20 different access points, right? So what's great about it? With every S3 access point, you get an access policy, which is quite similar to bucket policy. You can control that what sort of actions will be allowed at that particular access point level. I'll show you this thing in our demo, so it will be clear to you, but it is similar to bucket policy. At least in the grammar, it is similar to bucket policy. Next thing is you can set up the property at the access point level, which is called network origin, which means whether this access point would be accessible from internet or from a particular VPC. So you can go ahead and tie it down to a particular VPC as well. So you may have seen that many times we have a requirement that a particular bucket should be accessible only from a VPC, right? Earlier, let's say if you had one bucket, and within that bucket, if you had a requirement that one of the folders should be accessible from internet, let's say, and the other folder should be accessible only from VPC, it was not possible to really tie it down that well. But with access points, you can clearly segregate, right? You can have one access point which will have network origin as internet, and you can have another access point which can have network origin as VPC, right? So that's a really good feature. Other things are, you get a unique S3 URI. Remember those S3:/ things which you use in your CLI commands. So you get an S3 URI with every access point. You also go ahead and get an ARN. So wherever you have to use ARN, you can use these. For example, you can use them while writing IAM policies, right? You also get an access point alias, which is really good. This is going to be a unique string, and you can use this in place of bucket name, in any of your requests. So like in any request where you have to specify a bucket name, you can also specify, instead of bucket name, you can go ahead and specify this access point alias, right? So with every access point which you create, you get all of these properties. And as we discussed, you can go ahead and actually create multiple access points for a bucket, and hence the overall management becomes quite simple, right? And scaling part, as you have more and more applications or teams getting onboarded to go ahead and access a particular S3 bucket, it becomes quite easy for you to scale this whole operation, right? Remember, one important thing is that in order to be able to access a particular object via an access point, you need to ensure that both the access point and the underlying bucket must permit that request, right? So if you just try to think, how would access point permit the request? Via access policy. How would S3 bucket permit the request? Via bucket policy, right? So we will dig deeper into this in our demonstration. First, let me show you a diagram to explain this thing, that how access points actually work. So let's say you have got an S3 bucket, and we have a requirement that for business unit 1, there is an application which should be able to access the files or the data inside BU01 folder. And same way, we have a user from business unit 2 who should be able to access the files or resources inside BU02 folder, right? Simple. So what we can do is we can go ahead and create an access point. Let's call it APBU01, for example. And what we'll do is, on that particular access point, we will go ahead and apply an access policy. And in that particular access policy, we will write that actions are allowed only on /BU01 folder, right? I'll show you by doing this, but you can specify that, let's say, read and write or S3 put object or S3 get object is allowed only on a particular folder. In this case, it is BU01 folder, right? So basically, if let's say role BU01 tries to write to another folder BU02, that won't be allowed. Okay, that won't happen. It is also possible that you can write deny statements. You know that in AWS, while you are writing any policy, you can have allow and deny statements both, right? So yes, you can write deny statements as well, and I'll try to cover some example of that as well in our demo. But generally, to start with, please understand that you will go ahead and allow access on a particular folder using this access policy, right? The other important thing, and I think very important point actually, is that how do you go ahead and set up the policy for your IAM role or for your IAM user? See, one thing is that within an account, within an AWS account, if you just go ahead and set up access policy, right, and give access to a particular user or role, that user or role would be able to go ahead and do that action. If you are not clear about this statement, I would request you to watch one of our previous videos, which is about how different AWS policies come together and work, if you're not clear about the statement. But coming back to this, it is recommended that whenever you are actually specifying, or if you are actually allocating permissions to a particular user or role, to be able to go ahead and interact with an S3 access point, what you should do is, in that particular policy, in the resource section, you can actually specify access point as the resource, right? So what I'm saying is, for example, if I am actually allocating certain permissions to my role BU01, which is here, so for this particular role BU01, I should not give permissions directly to the S3 bucket. I should not do that. Instead of that, while I'm writing that IAM policy BU01 access point, that can be specified in the resource. Its ARN can be picked up and that can be specified in the resource section. I will show you this thing as well as part of the demo, right? So that way you are not enabling your role to go ahead and hit the S3 bucket directly. There itself you are stopping it. So that can be a good practice which you can follow in your organization, that instead of directly giving access to different identities to go ahead and hit the S3 bucket, we will actually go ahead and give permissions only to hit the access points. You can follow that, right? So that's how you will go ahead and do it. And tomorrow when, for user BU02 needs access to BU02 folder, for that you can have another access point, and so on and so forth. As more and more teams get onboarded, the process is quite simple, right? And you can actually just go on creating new access points. As I already told you, each access point enforces a customized access point policy, right? Which you saw at the top. Now this access point policy has to work in conjunction with the bucket policy, right? For example, let's say role BU01 is trying to do a particular action, let's say S3 put object via access point BU01. So ultimately for that action to succeed, right? For that action to succeed, the access point policy should also allow that action, and then the bucket policy should also allow that action, right? So you might be thinking whether I need to go ahead and write allow in both the places. Yes, you will have to, or there is a way through which you can avoid that. So we will see that in our upcoming demo. All right. So as part of our demo, there are a couple of things which we want to cover. First one is that how should you go ahead and specify the permission of an IAM user or role? Okay. If you have to specify, what should you specify there? Post that, we will try and understand difference between access point access from internet and VPC. So we discussed that there can be two types of network level access, right? So we'll see the difference between them. Then we'll see how to delegate access control to access point and benefit from not updating bucket policy every time. So I was just telling you that you need to make sure that a particular action is allowed at the access point policy level and also at the bucket policy level. That would mean that with every new team getting onboarded, you'll have to go and update the bucket policy. It just beats the whole purpose, right? Why we were creating access points. So there is a way to avoid that, and we will see that part. Post that, we will see scenarios that how things work when there is no policy applied at the access point level, no access policy applied at the access point level. After that, we'll see if there is an allow policy applied at the access point level. Then we will see how can you go ahead and give folder level access with different access points, right? Something what we were seeing in the previous slide. Post that, we will also see that how can you go ahead and specify a deny policy at the bucket level, because you want to protect a particular folder, right? Which is non-negotiable, right? You want to protect that particular folder inside your bucket. That's why specifying a deny policy at the bucket level, and then you have an allow at the access point level, and how do they come together and work. We will also see that how can you go ahead and completely restrict the access of objects at bucket level and only allow actions from access point, which means if somebody tries to hit, if somebody has been given access to the S3 bucket, right, via their identity based policies, even then they should not be able to go ahead and access the objects from the bucket. How do we achieve that? And how do we enforce that people have to hit access points only to be able to access your objects? So that would be our last thing which we'll see in the demo. So it's gonna be a detailed one, and I request you to go ahead and probably open your own AWS account so that you can go ahead and do it along with me. It's perfectly possible. Go ahead and just open it and let's do it together. Okay, let's get into it. All right, let's move ahead. So I'm currently logged in to my management console, and I have got an S3 bucket called FMW115. This is just a plain simple bucket. If you look at its bucket policy, currently it's empty. So there's no bucket policy applied, right? So I've just created this bucket, and what we'll do next is we'll go ahead and create 2 access points, right? And the difference between the two would be one of them would be accessible from internet, another one would be accessible only from a VPC. And which VPC? So we have a VPC in place here. This is the VPC ID, right? You can remember EF7D. This is the VPC ID. It has got 2 public subnets and 2 private subnets. So we will go ahead and actually utilize this particular VPC ID. Okay. So let's go here and say create access point. So we will go ahead and give it a name. Okay. And you can see bucket name is already mentioned because I actually used the interface to come from a particular bucket dashboard. That's why this bucket name is pre-populated. In network origin, I'm choosing VPC, and I will go ahead and paste the VPC ID here, right? So this is done. As you have seen that we can go ahead and do block all public access setting at the bucket level. Same way at the, at the access point level also, you can go ahead and change this if you like. So for now, I'm keeping access point policy as blank. I'll go ahead and say create access point. So this creates our first access point, which is there from, where the network origin is a particular VPC. You can see an access point alias also got created, which is a unique string and can be used instead of a bucket name. Okay. So what we'll do next is we'll go ahead and create another access point quickly. This one, I'm going to call it public. Okay. And in network origin, I'll say internet. So it is not asking me VPC ID, of course. I'm going to keep the access policy blank, and I'll just say create access point. Okay, so both of our access points are created. Good. So what we'll do is I'll first just quickly show you that how the access happens from this particular access point, right? And in order to show that, I'll make use of an IAM user. So we have an IAM user here called Gopal, and currently, if you see, this IAM user has got only 2 policies attached, and one is EC2, one is Cloud Shell Full Access. There are no S3 related permissions with Gopal. So ideally, if Gopal tries to go ahead and actually execute any action against S3, that should not work unless until we go ahead and actually allocate some permissions, right? Unless until we go ahead and actually allocate some permission either to Gopal directly, or it happens via bucket policy or an access policy, right? So we will do all of that step by step. So first thing which I want to do is I want to go ahead and just quickly show you the difference between these two, right? So of course, the first one is accessible from internet. So it would be accessible from anywhere. The second one is accessible only from VPC. So I'll just quickly show you that how this one will not be accessible from public. So if I go ahead and try to hit this particular access point, it will not be accessible. Okay, so what I could do for that is I can go ahead and try to just execute it right from the Cloud Shell here. So I'll open Cloud Shell, and in order to access this from our VPC, what I have done is I've also created an EC2 instance, in our VPC. I showed you the VPC already. In that VPC, I've created an EC2 instance. And one more thing to explain you, though this particular instance is there in the public subnet, but if I show you the public subnet here, in the public subnet, there is an entry for the VPC endpoint, which has been created for S3, right? So any traffic from this EC2 instance, which is going to S3, actually doesn't go via internet gateway, rather it goes via this S3 endpoint. So this is very important, right? If the traffic goes from your EC2 instance via internet and then tries to hit that access point, it won't work, because at the access point level, you have a specified network origin to be the VPC, right? So what should be the right way of the traffic flow? The correct method there would be that traffic should go from your EC2 instance via S3 VPC endpoint, right? Which is this one. Via that it should go and it should hit S3. So in that way, it is not going via internet, right? So you can see that we have this entry, and I have already connected to this EC2 instance here, right? So if I go ahead and try to do AWS S3LS from this EC2 instance, you can see this is working. But why? Why is it working? This is working because I have also given an IAM role to this EC2 instance. Just to show you this demo, what I did, I have given an IAM role to this EC2 instance called S3 access role, and it's a very simple role. Just to keep it simple, we will get into complex policy just in a minute. But for now, in this S3 access role, I've just given very simple policy S3 full access, because here just I want to show you the network part, right? So that means this particular EC2 instance has all the rights, to interact with S3. That's why when I execute AWS S3LS, it works. Now the next thing which I will do is I will go ahead and do AWS S3LS. And this time I will do S3:, and I'll go ahead and pick up this particular VPC endpoint, right? Basically, the access point which I created, which is specific to a VPC or which is restricted to a VPC, I will go ahead and copy its S3 URI. Okay, so I'll go here and I'll try to paste this and we'll say enter. And you can see it works, right? It did not give me any error. Just to confirm it further, what we could do is, let's say create a file here, and we can do so the upload also worked. If you want, we can go ahead and check here. There is file A1 uploaded here, right, in the bucket. And it happened via this particular access point. Now, if I just go to my Cloud Shell, right? Now currently I'm operating as an administrator user in this account. And of course, if I run AWS S3LS, it will work, right? But if I try to run AWS S3LS and then I paste this particular thing, will it work? Answer is no. Why? Because this request is going from internet. From Cloud Shell, it is going and hitting this access point from internet. Basically, this particular request is not originating from the VPC which has been specified, and hence it is not working. So I hope you understand that. I hope you understand the difference between an access point which has VPC as the origin and an access point which has internet as the origin. Let me just quickly show you. I'll go to the other access point and I'll go ahead and copy this URI. This is the public one. So if I run AWS S3LS and I'll paste this thing, you can see it works, right? So I hope that part is clear. So that covers our first thing, which is basically what is the difference between access point which has a network origin as VPC and network origin as internet. Moving on to the next thing, we will Now try to understand different different use cases which we had talked about. First thing is that we need to be very clear that what permission we need to give to the identity which is trying to access S3 access point. So we should always follow the principle of least privilege, which means give somebody only that much permissions which are really required for that person or for that identity to go ahead and do their job. You should not allocate anything more than the required permissions. So we'll come back to our user Gopal. So currently this user Gopal, as you can see, has no permissions related to S3. So if I want that this particular user Gopal should interact my access point, my this particular access point. So you can see that I have created, let me go here and I'll go to this particular bucket. So I've got 2 access points. So if I want that my user Gopal should interact with this particular access point or should interact with this particular access point, then I have to ensure that only I will give access for Gopal to interact with this one only. That's how I should write the policy for Gopal. Okay. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and actually write the policy for Gopal so that Gopal can actually access this access point. And for that, we will utilize the ARN of this particular access point. So let's go here. Currently, you can see Gopal has no permissions. I'll go ahead and write a policy. Okay. So in this policy, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and choose service as S3. And let's say I want to allow Gopal to be able to do get object and put object. So I'll search for those. Right. And then I need to go to resources and I should specify that particular access point. Now, if I go here and I paste this, it gives me an error. Now that's a problem. In this place, you can actually not put, at this point, you are not able to put access point AR and it doesn't recognize it as correct. So what I'll do is for now, I'll just say all resources and then I'll go to this JSON window and here I can go and put it like this, right? So that's the ARN, but you know that actions like get object, put object, these actions happen at the object level, not at the bucket level as such, right? Whereas this particular thing kind of represents a bucket or an access point, not the objects inside it. So how do you specify the objects inside this? You will have to write in this way. Okay. Normally in case of bucket ARN, you put bucket name and then you say /star, right? But in case of access point, you need to write this term object and then you need to say /star. If you want to limit this to a particular folder, let's say I have a folder called BU01 within my bucket, then what I'll do, I'll write it like BU01 /star like this. So, but remember this object term you'll have to include. Okay. So this is the policy which I have written. I'll say next and I'm gonna name this policy as FMW115 get put policy. So that's what I'm naming it for now, simple name, and we'll say create policy. This policy gets created and I will go ahead and actually add this policy or attach this policy to our user Gopal. So we'll go here and we'll say add permissions, go here and we'll say, we'll select this one and we'll say next and add permissions. Okay. So now you can see our user Gopal has got this particular policy attached. So which means our user Gopal will be able to hit this particular access point, right? It does not mean that our user Gopal can go ahead and hit the FMW115 bucket directly. No, Gopal user can only hit this access point. Okay, and I've chosen the public one so that I can directly run the commands from the browser using Cloud Shell. All right, now what I'll do is, let me show you this one. I have a browser open here and in this browser, I have user Gopal, I'm logged in as user Gopal, and I have Cloud Shell open. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and execute the commands from here against the access point, and we'll see what happens. All right. So let's try to run AWS S3 LS, and you can see it gives me an error, right? Because as such, Gopal doesn't have permission to run AWS, like list buckets. That type of permission is not there. Gopal has very specific permissions to do get object and put object, and that too only against a particular access point. So if Gopal does, let's do this. Gopal creates a file here, right? I'm gonna call it G file, and I'll go ahead and do AWS S3 CP G file, and I will try to copy this to this bucket first. Let's see if it works. It won't, because Gopal doesn't have permission. Now the next thing is we'll go ahead and try to copy this by using the access point. So if I go here and just copy this particular URI, right? So I'll say so this particular action actually failed. Why so? It is because we have actually not done an important step yet, which is, if you remember, we were discussing that when you want to go ahead and use access point, basically any action which is being allowed, which is being allowed by the access point, that should also be allowed by the bucket policy. Well, currently, as such, we have not allowed this particular action at the access point level. So that's why this is not happening. Okay. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and add the necessary policy at the access point level. So let me go here and we'll go to permissions. We will say edit, and we'll say add new statement, and in the principal we'll say AWS, and here I will put Gopal's ARN. Okay, in the actions we'll say S3 get object, and we'll say put object, and in the resource we will copy this access point and we'll say we'll put it here, right? And you remember we need to put it like this in case of access point. So we'll say save. So now this is done. We have applied the policy at the access point level. Will it work now? Let's try and check. So we'll go ahead and try to copy the file once again using the access point URI. It still failed. Why so? Because we have not done a part yet. You remember, we have not done anything at the bucket policy level. So the bucket policy is still empty. So what are we required to do? Either we should go ahead and add this type of policy at the bucket policy level as well. But then it beats the whole purpose of setting up access point. If we have to go ahead and keep updating the bucket policy for all the policies which we are putting in every access point, then it's not a scalable model. So what we can do here is we can go to the to our bucket. Let's go here, go to our buckets, and we can go ahead and actually paste one policy at the bucket policy level which delegates the access control to access point. Let me show you what it is. Okay, so what we are doing here is we are allowing for all the principals, that means for any identity within AWS, any possible action on the bucket ARN. So we need to copy this and we need to update the bucket ARN here, and of course inside that bucket, all the objects as well are covered. So basically all the actions against this bucket or the objects inside that bucket. But the condition here is that data access point account, the action which is happening, that action should be happening from an access point whose owner is a particular account number. Which account number? Let's copy this and we'll paste it here. So we are basically saying these actions are, any action is allowed provided the access point from where that action is coming, the owner for that access point is this particular account. And what is this account ID? This account ID is this current account's account ID, right? So by putting this particular bucket policy, now I'll go ahead and say save. By putting this particular bucket policy, what I have done now is I have actually delegated the access to the access point. I've delegated the access control to access point. Now I can go ahead and have 5-10 different access points against this one bucket, and I need not come and touch this bucket policy again, right? Because by writing this bucket policy, I am not trusting the policy which has been mentioned at the access point level, right? I'll not do any more change here. I'll just go now to the user Gopal and we'll just go ahead and execute this command once again and see. You can see the upload worked, right? We can go ahead and run. I cannot run AWS S3LS because that permission has not been given, right? So I cannot run AWS S3LS, but I can go ahead and show you this G file from here, right? So if I go to the objects and I'll just say refresh, you can see G file got uploaded, right? So we saw that how you can go ahead and make this work, by delegating the access control to the access point, right? Now at this point, what's happening is, of course, our user Gopal, let me just show you once again, our user Gopal has this policy attached, and then this policy, the actions which are allowed are only these two, and that too only to this particular access point. I already showed you that if Gopal tries to invoke an action to let's say FMW 115 bucket, it won't work, right? And I've shown you the access point policy as well. One more thing, one very small thing I'll show you. Let me just detach this policy from Gopal for a minute. Okay, so now Gopal doesn't have any S3 related actions attached or S3 related policies attached to the user Gopal. But you know what? The access point policy works similar to, works in the same way as bucket policy works. So because in this particular access point, the policy which is written in that, I am allowing this particular user Gopal to go ahead and do these two actions. So Gopal will be able to do these two actions even now. Let's try and check that. I'll go ahead and create a file. I'm going to call it D file, and then I'll just go ahead and try to copy this. You can see upload worked, right? Let's go here and refresh. You can see D file got uploaded, right? And you can very well verify that Gopal doesn't have any S3 related permissions attached. If you're not clear about this, I've talked about this in a detailed video. You will find the link of that video. You can go ahead and watch it or look at the description later on. This is very important for you to understand. I would suggest that you pause this video and watch that video first if this part is not clear to you. Okay, so we have looked at a couple of options already. So let's review once. We have understood what permissions you should give to an IAM user or role. We have to give as least as possible and make sure that you specify that access point ARN in the resource. We understood the difference. We understood how to delegate access control to an access point. And hence we don't have to modify the bucket policy again and again. We looked at these two things as well. Now let's try to see this part. Giving folder level access with different access points. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll now go to this particular access point, and I'm gonna edit this, and I will say, instead of enabling this user Gopal to be able to write anywhere in this bucket, what I'm gonna do is I am limiting this user to this particular folder. Let's say BU01 folder. I'll say save. Okay. Now what happens? Let's say if this particular user Gopal now creates again one more file and tries to copy this file. Right? Will it work? Answer is no. You see that upload failed. Why is it so? Because now the access point is allowing the upload only inside a particular folder, right? If user tries to upload inside some other folder like this, even then it will fail. But if user uploads only to the correct folder, which is BU01, it should work. So you can see it got uploaded. If I go here to this particular thing, if I refresh, you will see that BU01 folder got created, and inside that this W file is there. Of course, it in the UI it shows up as folder. Actually, it's all it is all just prefixes, right? That's all it is. I hope you get that point, right? This user can very well go ahead and do this as well, right? For example, something like this, possible. So inside BU1, of course, it is allowed. So if I now go here and refresh, you will see my folder got created inside that W file came. So I hope you understood that how you can go ahead and give access to different folders, right? So now let's say I have got 2 different users or 4 different users. User 1 should be able to access folder 1. User 2 should be able to access folder 2. So I can go ahead and tweak the access policy accordingly. All I have to do is I have to tweak the access policy here. If let's say a particular user requires access to 2-3 folders, then I can very well add 2-3 ARNs here. I can even tweak the access policy in such a way that let's say user Gopal will have get object and put object on BU01 folder and BU02 folder, and user Gopal will have just get object. I can write another statement here where I'll give user Gopal only get object on a third folder, which is called read only folder, for example. So I can very well go ahead and do that. So I hope that part is clear as well. The next one which I want to show you is how can you go ahead and protect a particular folder by specifying a deny statement at the bucket level, right? So if you now just try to think with access point, how your operation model is, maybe an S3 bucket got created, and post that you have allowed either via infrastructure as code or by ClickOps, you have allowed a team to go ahead and create new access point. And you saw that we have already specified a bucket policy because of which this bucket is actually trusting, right, all the access points, or has delegated the control to access point. Now, what if there is a use case? What if you have a scenario that there is a particular folder in this bucket from where the object should never get deleted, but somebody can go ahead and write an access point policy in which the person may give delete object permission, on that particular folder as well, but you don't want that to happen. So how will you handle such a scenario? Let's go ahead and see that. So what I'll do is I will go ahead and I'll go to first, let me go here in my bucket FMW115, and I'm gonna just create a folder here called read only. Okay, so this folder is created, and what I would do is I'll just go ahead and put a file as well in this particular in this particular folder. Okay, so this file is uploaded called picture1.png, and it is there in the read only folder. what I'll do is I'll go to permissions now. Within this particular bucket, I'll go to bucket policy and I'll say edit, and I'll go ahead and add one more statement, right? I'll say add new statement. And in this statement, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and say for all the principals, I'm gonna write a deny, right? And action is s3 colon delete object, and in resource I will go ahead and put, I'll copy this, okay, but in this I'll say I'll put here read only, like this, right? Because this is bucket policy, we do not put that word object. I hope you remember that part. So what I'm saying, inside this bucket fmw115 read only folder, inside that star. So basically all the objects inside this folder on that delete object is denied by everyone, right? This is what I've done. Okay, so if I go ahead and put this particular statement as part of bucket policy, what happens? Let's go ahead and check this. So I saved this, great. Now I will go here to the access point and let's edit this, okay? And what I'll do is just to understand this fact, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and give s3 delete object as well. Okay, so we are giving s3 delete object, and let me just remove this thing. So basically I'm saying that inside the bucket everywhere I'm giving all these three actions allowed. So that's what I'm doing via this access point. So be very clear, at the access point level I have modified the access point policy and I'm allowing all these three actions, even delete object, in the overall bucket actually, right? Because you can see object slash star. Now let's go to Gopal. Okay, so here is Gopal. Let me make this somewhat smaller or clear this better. Okay, so before I run the command here, let's go and look at the objects. So let's try to delete this object first. Okay, so I'll say AWS S3 RM, and I need to copy the URI. We need to say okay, while referring a particular object, I don't need to put the word object here. That is only when you are writing the ARN, right? At that time you need to use the word object while you are writing the IAM policy. So in front of ARN you need to use that. As part of S3 URI you don't have to. So here I will write it like this. Okay, so I'm trying to delete A1 file. Let's see. You can see delete was successful. Let me refresh this. A1 is gone. Okay, in the same way, if I go ahead and try to delete something else like D file, it should go. That's also working. But now I will try to delete the file, which is this one, picture1.png. So I'll say read only slash picture1.png. Okay, you can see delete failed. Why so? Because at the access point level, yes, I have allowed it, but there is an explicit deny written at the bucket policy level. And you know that in AWS, if there is an explicit deny anywhere which comes into picture, that wins. So because there is an explicit deny there, because of that, your folder got saved, or the valuable files which were there inside that particular folder, that got saved. So this is a really good method which you can follow if you want to kind of save those type of files which are really like non-negotiable, right? So you can go ahead and do it in that way. And like I wrote that bucket policy to be to be somewhat simpler, I just denied it for everyone, right? You can go ahead and write the principal part there. Basically what I'm saying is you can go ahead and actually write the principal part here to be somewhat more specific. For example, you can write it in such a way that you are denying for certain users or for certain roles. It's up to you, or you can use wildcards there. So in that way also you can go ahead and deny. But the point is, once you deny it here, then those users cannot go ahead and actually delete the stuff, even if it is allowed at the access point level. Okay, that brings us to the last item, which is, what if we want to completely restrict the access of objects at the bucket level, and we want to allow actions only happening from the access point level, right? Let's say we want to go ahead and enforce such a restriction that if somebody hits this bucket endpoint directly and tries to access any object, that should fail. What can we do for that, right? But when the person accesses the file from access point, it should work. So if we want to go ahead and do such a thing, what we could do is we can go ahead and write a statement in the bucket policy. Okay, so we'll go ahead and try to edit this bucket policy. And now what I'll do is I'll leave this first statement there. I'll just get rid of this one, or I can actually modify this itself. So in this I'll say deny, for all the AWS principles, and I'll say S3 get object, right? This is denied for all the resources inside this bucket. So I'll just say this, right, basically. And further to this, I'll go ahead and add a condition as well. So I'll go ahead and add a condition, and condition will be something like this. Okay, so in this condition, what we are saying, we will say string not like. So the string is not like this thing. Okay, is not like this thing. And here we will go ahead and put let's try to pick up the AR in here. So we'll go ahead and actually put this. We'll go ahead and put it here. And instead of specifying any particular access point, I'll remove this and we'll put it this way. So this actually means all the access points in my account within US East 1 region, right? That's what it means. So the idea is that if somebody is trying to do get object, and that get object is not happening from this access point, from one of the access point in this particular account in the US East 1 region, right? And that get object is ultimately trying to happen from this particular bucket, that particular action won't be allowed. It will be denied. Let's go ahead and test this. Okay, so I'll go ahead and say save. All right, so first what I'll do is I'll go back to this particular EC2 instance. You remember this EC2 instance? This EC2 instance has all the permissions, right? It has S3 full access, like the role which has been attached. This is the role. I will remind you, this is the role. It has S3 full access. So I'll go here and I'll try to do AWS S3 CP, and I'll say S3:/ FMW115, and I want to copy a file from here. Let's see what file is available. So there's a file here called G file, right? Let's refresh this and see G file. Okay, so we'll go ahead and say G file. And I'm trying to copy it to my local. You see here, it says forbidden. Okay, so we couldn't copy that file, right? You can see there is no G file here. Okay, fine. Now let me let me go here. What I'll do is, from user Gopal, we'll try to download the same file, but this time using the access point. Okay, so we'll say clear and we'll say ls. I'll make sure that all the files are removed from here. Okay, everything is clean. So we'll say AWS S3CP, and this time I'll go ahead and use this particular thing, right? And from here I'll say /g file, and this should come to local. And you can see download happened. I got the G file downloaded. So what happened here really, right? What happened is that I went ahead and at this particular bucket level I implemented a bucket policy, and in that bucket policy, I have actually denied get object. I have denied get object to anyone if that is not happening via an access point, right? Because you can see I've mentioned string not like. So the string is not like this for the data access point ARN, then it will fail. So if people are coming via access point, it will work. If anybody, even if somebody has got S3 full access attached to that person, if that person tries to actually go ahead and access this bucket directly, it won't work. I showed you just now. That particular IAM role has S3 full access, but still, that role could not access the bucket directly. But if we go ahead and we try to access via access point, it works. So that kind of summarizes it all for us. We looked at different things here, like what should be the permission for an IAM user or role. Try to give it minimum. I'm repeating it. If you want to hit access point, S3 access point, give S3 access point as the resource. Give access point ARN in the resource. We understood the difference between internet and VPC network origin. We understood how can you go ahead and delegate access control to access point, when there's no policy, when there's an allow policy, all of these things. How can you go ahead and give folder level access? That also we saw. How can you protect a certain folder or content inside a certain folder by adding a deny policy? And we also saw that how can you go ahead and with the help of an additional a statement in your bucket policy, you can actually force people to use access point only, and if they directly hit bucket, they the action will fail. I hope that video helped you and you got some clarity with S3 access point. I've seen that people generally get confused with this, so the best way for you to be really clear with this particular concept is go ahead and do this. Okay, please go ahead and actually write these policies and test it out, and you will be confident. If you still have any doubts, feel free to write it in the comment section and I'll try my best to answer that. If you want to watch more such videos and practical demos, look at our playlists in the video description. We'll meet again very soon. Till then, bye-bye.